Among many ex-Soviet republics and their neighbors, there are a whole range of simmering tensions. And these are now being exacerbated by the current war that Russia is engaging with, the imperialist war against Ukraine. Also, we see a flood of propaganda coming out of Russia, which plays in some countries, and in others, it has relatively little impact. We're going to be exploring the impacts of the war on foreign relations and the impact on the flood of Russian propaganda in countries like Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, areas that fall within the ex-Soviet sphere of influence. Today, I'm speaking to Rahim Rahimov, who is a Baku-based member of the management board of the Tbilisi Association of European Studies for the Caucasus. So welcome to the channel.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Thank you so much. Well, let's start with your area of expertise, because I think for me and for many of the people listening to this, much of what you're going to say is not being reported in Western news. It's little understood, but Russia's war is triggering all sorts of reactions, isn't it, in a diverse set of countries that used to fall within the Soviet sphere?
Yes, indeed, all ex-Soviet republics closely watch what's going between Ukraine and Russia. For some countries like Azerbaijan and Georgia are familiar with this kind of conflict starting from the late 80s, early 90s in Karabakh, Abkhazia, Ossetia, and also Transnistria in Moldova. But it was unthinkable for most people in this region that a war between Ukraine and Russia may ever break out. But it happened. On one hand, it was unthinkable to see this war. But on the other hand, if you closely, daily basis, watch the Russian TV and media, starting from 2014, it was not so much unexpectable because there was a flood of information and propaganda aimed against Ukraine. It was kind of preparing the population for what was coming. And if you know Russian politics, how the media and politics function in Russia, you know that that kind of information and propaganda has a reason. And it was clear in February that Russia is going into the war with Ukraine. But what it means for this region, South Caucasus, again, if you watch the Russian information space, you could see that Ukraine most probably will not be the last conflict that Russia has launched. Every country is worried and concerned that what will happen after Ukraine. In case Russia achieves its goals in Ukraine, the same similar scenarios may break out in this region. Other countries, even inside Russia, they understand very well. One prominent Russian expert told his audience over the social media that it is easy to understand these republics like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and others, because when war started in Ukraine, they start automatically thinking that happened to me. So that's why these countries are very worried about what is going in Ukraine.
And of course, it's not just 2022, is it? You know, the actual assault on Ukraine started in 2014. So there's been plenty of time for people to see how the hybrid war technology works, how the influence campaigns, the corruption, the bribes, the destabilization of Ukraine and the Donbass took place, how the hybrid war in Crimea worked. And prior to that, you had the invasion of Georgia in 2008. So yes, what's happened this year is shocking, but there's also a history, isn't there, of interference in ex-Soviet states that seek to create other alliances that look beyond Moscow for their key foreign policy relations. So there's a big history building up to this moment that you say is worrying people.
Yes, of course, all this whole Ukrainian conflict started with the annexation of Crimea, and then Eastern Ukrainian conflict in Donbass, in Donbass region. But what happened in February 24th was not even comparable to that, because this was a very large scale operation, and the media, the Russian media was kind of preparing for what was coming in Ukraine, because the media in Russia functions differently from the Western world. In Western countries is known, we know as what is known in the academic literature, deliberative democracy, in which deliberation, public debate, and discussion are central to taking decisions, adopting laws. And the role of media is to participate in this kind of deliberations, and to be successful in participation in these deliberations, you need to have argumentation. That's why they are also sometimes called argumentative democracies. But Russia is not a deliberative democracy. Russians, like Russian elite, as they sometimes love to call themselves sovereign democracy. In Russia, the role of media is different at the West, because in Russia, the media doesn't participate in deliberations for taking decisions. Its role rather to speak, to act as a loudspeaker for the decisions that has already been taken. So the role of media in Russia is post factum. The fact happens, and then media tries to rally support to justify that decision. So, and this kind of role oftentimes makes it inevitable to have heavy propaganda and disinformation, because the media has a specific role. It has to justify and rally popular support for a certain decision. In this case, so-called special military operation. So its role post factum, and in the best case, the role of media in Russia is to prepare the populations for the decision that is going to be decided or to be announced, and to be announced. But a positive side of this kind of function of media is that experts, foreign audiences, can follow this Russian media and predict or expect what is coming.
And is there a big difference? So you talked about there being a change in internal propaganda, a ramping up, as it were, to prepare the population for what turned out to be a full-scale war, reminiscent of the Second World War, as you say, with massive armies and massive mobilization of resources. Did you also see an increase in the external propaganda, the messages that are being targeted towards Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and even further than that, Turkey, Iran, countries which are either ambiguous or direct allies of Russia?
No, the information campaign mainly targeted all these years the Ukraine, Georgia, and Baltic states. Ukraine, Georgia, because of the color revolutions. But in spite of that, there was implicit messages for other countries, because the recent we see in Russian media, and that they see the imperial territories of the Russian Empire, the imperial borders, as their legitimate sphere of influence. So, and Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and the Central Asian countries are falling in this space, the post-Soviet space, the former imperial territories. I believe their propaganda or information warfare is not so successful. Is not, of course, it has some effect, but it is not as Russia would like to see it, because there are also different tools to counter information, not only from Russia, but also for any disinformation coming from outside of these countries. But still, to not to a considerable level, but to some level, this kind of information coming from Russia and outside produces a divisive effect in those countries. But again, it depends, it differs from case to case. In Azerbaijan, for example, we have our own Karabakh conflict since 30 years. So that's why we look at the Ukrainian, Azerbaijanis, you look at the Ukrainian conflict through the prism of Karabakh conflict. That's why the popular support are enormous for Ukraine. Georgia, the same, because Georgia has lost Abkhazia and Ossetia. But for example, in Armenia, it's a little bit different, because Armenia in favor of how to say, self-determination of people, or cessation of Karabakh from Azerbaijan, and Armenian side was seeing a precedent in the annexation of Crimea. So that's why it's not the same. It doesn't produce same effect in each country, because each of these nations has its own peculiarities.
So whether a country sees Russia as a partner or a primary partner or a threat is also influenced by local conflict and local issues. And some of these are long-term, aren't they? So this isn't the first time there's been conflicts around Nagorno-Karabakh. It's flared up many times. Has Russia in the past tried to be a mediator role, or does Russia use that conflict to apply pressure?
Actually, both. Russia has been from the start a mediator for all 30 years, and during the following this 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, it was Russia that mediated a trilateral declaration that ended the war. But simultaneously, Russia has own interests in conflict, because this conflict allows Russia to have certain leverage over the both sides of the conflict. But of course, local populations still see all these geopolitical things through their local experiences.
And this conflict, obviously, the conflict that really flared up this year in February, has that, in your view, changed how Moscow is viewed by countries in the region? Is it seen as more of a threat? And actually, has the immense internal instability the war and conscription is creating, does that make the states and countries in the ex-Soviet sphere themselves experience sort of greater instability?
Of course, it is seen as a threat, irrespective of the outcome of the war, who will win, whether there will be a winner, and also as a result of mobilization, the recent partial mobilization in Russia, we see people, in order to avoid military service, they are trying to flee Russia. And we see certain experts and public activists make alarm call in Georgia, that they see it as a threat to the stability in Georgia, because most people come to Georgia rather than Armenia and Azerbaijan, because they are spiritually, religiously close. Both are Orthodox countries, so they are culturally close. Also, the border ground, Russia has land border with Georgia. It is easy. There is no need for visa. There is no need for flight. You can just come by your car or by even foot. So that's one type of threat Georgia sees. But in a more global sense, if Russia wins in Ukraine, of course they are very concerned that it will not stop. It will go further, and these countries can be next target. But if Russia loses, then they think that Ukraine is much bigger than Georgia, Azerbaijan, or Armenia. And also, Ukraine in this conflict had full Western support, which Georgia didn't have in 2009, 2008, Ossetian War. So, in order to compensate its loss in Ukraine, so Russia might become more assertive in this smaller post-Soviet country. So it is like a double-edged sword for smaller Soviet republics. Whether Russia wins or loses, they feel threatened by that.
That's an interesting thought. So for Ukraine, there's a win-lose scenario. They win the war, they become a member of the European Union and potentially eventually a NATO member, and the map of Europe moves. You know, there's a line, there's a fortress line, a wall that moves eastwards close to the Russian border, but Ukraine is then on the European side and there's investment. So for them, there's a win-lose potential. You're saying here that for potentially Georgia and Azerbaijan, there's a lose-lose scenario. You know, you lose if Russia loses, you lose if Russia wins. How do you break out of that? Is there anything that these countries can do to reduce that threat?
Jonathan, I think I didn't say lose for Georgia, Azerbaijan, but I said in both scenarios they have they might feel threatened, but also this war brings kind of some advantages for these countries. For example, Russia doesn't want to lose Azerbaijan because it doesn't want to get absolutely marginalized. And considering that Azerbaijan is in alliance with Turkey and Russia has very good relations with Turkey, a NATO member, so it may have a positive side or too. But in general, that there are different scenarios, negative scenarios, and some positive effect also may have. And on the other side, Azerbaijan is in very excellent relations with Ukraine. Ukraine has been one of the explicit supporters of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity during the Karabakh conflict.
And Turkey is fascinating, isn't it? Because Turkey is able to play both sides to an extent. It's got those strong relationships with Russia. Russia is keen not to lose Turkey as an ally. It doesn't want Turkey to sort of vote against it in the UN or speak out. But at the same time, you have senior members of the Turkish elite, providing Bayraktar, providing support, drones, technology, equipment. The first ship, I think, in a potential Ukrainian Black Sea fleet was launched this week, manufactured in Turkey. So Turkey's playing a really interesting role by somehow keeping these opposing sides as allies. Could that be a template for Azerbaijan as well?
Turkey's position in this conflict and with Russia and in relation to Russia and Ukraine is very special. Is not special. Is very unique and interesting, as you mentioned. We first, to understand that, need to look at the Turkey's own interest. Turkey is a NATO member, but for recent years, it is clear that Turkey wants to remain a NATO member, but simultaneously it tries to achieve some strategic autonomy, a kind of emancipation from NATO, but without leaving NATO. NATO, because NATO has advantages for Turkey. It is important for Turkey's security and foreign policy. In fact, Turkey's value for Russia is connected to its NATO membership. Without NATO membership, Turkey wouldn't be so valuable for Russia. And Erdogan and Turkey knows it very well.
But that can limit some of the more extreme NATO policies potentially.
Yes, and recently one Finnish expert said that Turkey will remain in permanent opposition to NATO. That means it will always try to get strategic autonomy, and the rest of NATO will always disagree, but they will not divorce. There will be no divorce between NATO, rest of NATO, and Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
And Turkey's relations with Russia is very pragmatic. You say Turkey and Russia allies, but they're not allies. Russian leaders, including President Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, repeatedly stated that Russia and Turkey are not allies. They are strategic partners. So they advance this strategic partnership because it is in the interest of both countries. Russia, Turkey, first as a member of NATO, as a NATO member, it is a good good relations with Turkey. Provides a good optics for the Russian domestic audiences because it shows that Kremlin has kept very good relations with Turkey. Turkey didn't join sanctions against Russia, but on the other side, Turkey supports Ukraine's territorial integrity, and as you mentioned, it provided the Bayraktar drone. And Russian media and Russian public figures say that we are strategic partners, and it is a business. Turkey says it is just a business, and and Russians accept it because they want to have this level of partnership with Turkey. And Russian expert communities think that and view that West, in particular United States, doesn't want to see an alliance of Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And Ankara understands that well too. So Turkey uses all these opportunities in the current situation to the best interest of Turkey. And again, irrespective of the outcome of this war between Russia and Ukraine, Turkey's position has been much strengthened, and Turkey's reputation has been emboldened because Turkey is almost only mediator acting between Russia and Ukraine, and it has already some achievements, including exchange of prisoners of war and this grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, and etc. It is almost only communication channel between Russians and Ukrainians.
Now, this is really interesting because this idea of a strategic partnership makes Russian foreign policy sound quite pragmatic. It almost makes it sound more reasonable. However, one thing we're going to talk about is how Russian objectives are changing, aren't we? And I think we need to talk about the imperial idea, whether it's the reincarnation of the Tsarist Empire or resurrecting the Soviet Union. It does seem that Russia's concept of its borders are fluid and are being driven by something more than pragmatism. They're being driven by some ideological imperial idea. So could you talk a little bit about that, how that's come about and how that is changing the way Russia interacts with its neighbors?
Jonathan, your question reminds me an episode from Putin's speech at one event. He asked school children where the Russia's borders are, and one of the school children answered, and he mentioned certain geographical names, but Putin did disagree, interrupted him. He said, Russia's borders ends nowhere. So that I think pretty well illustrates a Russian view of borders. But if we look at the Russian media, I want to give you one interesting and fascinating example. In 2017, Russia marked centenary of the 1917 Russian Revolution. I watched at least 4 new films and documentaries dedicated to the 1917 revolution. It was a new approach, conspicuously new approach to presenting or portraying the revolution, 1917 revolutions to the Russian audiences. It's called Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the leader of the revolution and leader and founder of the Soviet state, as a terrorist. They called the revolution itself as a German-funded Judo-Masonic coup against Russia. And then they through those films, they show the historic borders of Russian Empire, imperial border. And then those films were trying to sacralize Russian imperial borders, and they used interesting methods. One of them is they portray the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas, as devout Christian who prays for the protection of Russian borders. And it resonates with real life process in Russia. The Russian church has canonized Nicola, the last Russian Tsar, and the Russian Orthodox Church views the October Revolution as Judo-Masonic coup. In those films, we could observe that not only Ukraine, not only Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, or Central Asia, but also Finland and parts of Poland are presented as historic Russian territories. So this kind of cultural productions sends message, and that message is known again as in academic literature as speech acts, because you make people to act with words, with speech. You prepare the people to take certain actions or to provide support for the certain actions. And that view of revolution, it is only not about a historic event, it is about today, because in last speech on 30 September to declare the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, Vladimir Putin again said that we are in a battlefield for Большая историческая Россия, big historic Russia. And what is this big historic Russia? It is not the Russian Federation we see now. Historic Russia is the Russian territories that were presented in those documentaries, in those films, and almost in Russian media on daily basis. And that those Russian territories includes all post-Soviet countries. So that's another worrying thing for the neighbors of Russia.
So Novorossiya, to an extent at the moment extends into the southern coast, Odessa, maybe into Transnistria. So there's Novorossiya, but there's also this, as you say, big imperial concept, and that takes in a lot more territory. And of course, for those who aren't aware, the Baltics, Finland did form part of the Russian Empire, but what I think the propaganda leaves out is they had a high degree of autonomy at the same time. So I know there was an effort in the 19th century to Russify these territories in the late 19th century, but until that point, they had significant local autonomy and significant tolerance of local language and culture. Not so much, of course, for Ukraine, but these little nuances, these little details of the imperial history, they're left out of the story, aren't they? Because they complicate that story.
Yeah. So one very significant nuance that's left out of the context in those films and also in the public speech of the Russian leaders and Russian elites, they usually, almost always, portray the October Revolution, the 1917 Russian revolutions, as cause for the rise of national separatism in the regions of the Russian Empire, the current independent republics like Ukraine. But they absolutely, utterly ignore the role the secessionist movements or the independence movements in those regions lead up to the weakening of the Russian Empire. They portray the causal relationship between October Revolution and independence movements or pro-independence sentiments in the regions of Russia, vice versa. So they see it as those movements, independence, ambitions of those regions or those countries as a result of the October Revolution. But if you look at history, they are not result. They are one of the causes for the weakening of Russian Empire. And by the way, Bolsheviks, in particular Lenin, took the opportunity. Lenin has one famous letter. It's called a letter regarding national issue and autonomization. So what is that letter? There is one incident took place in Georgia. It is known in the historiography as Georgian incident. The local communist leadership, of Georgia disagreed with the Moscow-appointed Ordzhonikidze, and there was a fight between them, and that's why. And Lenin wrote a letter to the Communist Party leadership that we have to be careful, and they need to have a right to exit. Stalin and others disagreed with him, but if we follow through the works of Lenin, he paid a special attention to this national issue. National issue meant that these countries like Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and others wanted independence from Russian Empire. And in fact, in 1918, Ukraine, Georgia, Russia, Azerbaijan, and others declared their independence, and they lived a short, around 2 years of independence. Then Bolshevik takeover ended the independence.
Yeah. So once the Russian Civil War was complete and they had, defeated the white forces within Russia itself, that almost immediately transferred into what amounted to imperialist wars to take back the territories of the Tsarist controlled areas, didn't it? Now, I love the comment. I think the comment you made earlier was really interesting. about that sort of horrible characterization of Bolshevism as a sort of Jewish Masonic sort of infection into the body politic of Russia, but also communism and the Bolsheviks are also now seen as a Western disease, a Western import as well, aren't they? And I think there's an interesting connection, because the reason why we're seeing, I would say, genocidal behavior in Ukraine, which is, the filtration of people, the kidnapping of women, children, taking them to Russia. We're seeing horrific crimes. We're seeing the destruction of cultural centers. This, to an extent, also plays back to that idea of, if the Bolshevik Revolution was a Western import, then also Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainian national identity is also a Western disease designed to divide Ukrainians from Russians, to create a distinction which in Putin's mind doesn't exist. It's an artificial distinction. So they're like cleansing Ukraine of these imported ideas. Now, I know Ukrainians see this very differently. I imagine everyone out in the countries we talked about sees it differently. But do you make a connection between the way the revolution is being portrayed and Putin's actions in Ukraine?
In his 30 September speech, Putin made many statements, but now I want to draw your attention to two of them. He said that following the revolution, Bolsheviks drew the borders of created this republic, Soviet republics, and the borders were artificial, kind of artificial. But he added that, but we don't want to restore Soviet Union. We don't need it. It's a good news for many people in post-Soviet countries, but I think it is too early to be happy, because just a bit later in the same speech, he said, we are in the battlefield for big historic Russia. And his speech was interrupted by applause. And those applause was orchestrated by the Speaker of the Russian Parliament, the State Duma. And then again, he repeated that battlefield for big historic Russia. And so I think they reframing that the intention to restore the Soviet Union to rebuilding or building a big historic Russia. And I think that is not good news for post-Soviet countries, because it means Russia sees those countries as part of big historic Russia. And in the same speech, Putin also quoted a very controversial Russian philosopher who is considered one of the main ideologues of the white movement after the revolution, Ivan Ilyin. Ivan Ilyin was exiled in so-called philosophership. Around 160 philosophers and intellectuals were deported by the Bolsheviks. And then he moved to Germany. If you look again to the works of Ivan Ilyin, by the way, since Vladimir Putin oftentimes quotes Ivan Ilyin, he's regarded in the media as ideological source for Vladimir Putin. And what I don't know if indeed Vladimir Putin is inspired by Ivan Ilyin or not, but it is still very useful to look at the Ivan Ilyin's works, because his works resonate with Vladimir Putin, or Vladimir Putin's statements well resonate with Ivan Ilyin's works. And on one occasion, many years ago, Vladimir Putin said that he has repeatedly read one specific paper by Ivan Ilyin. That paper is known as "What Does the Dismembering of Russia Promise to the World?" In that work, Ivan Ilyin speaks about dismembering of Russia. But when he means dismembering of Russia in 1940s and 1950s, he did these works. Actually, disintegration of the Soviet Union. So, and he has another piece called Sovietsky Soyuz ne Россия. Soviet Union is not Russia. But actually, he means territorially, Soviet Union is Russia, but politically, culturally, otherwise, is not Russia. So Ivan Ilyin sees these different countries around Russia, post-Soviet countries, part of historic Russia, and they were disintegrated as a result of the revolution, post-Soviet October Revolution. And the Vladimir Putin's statements echo the same message, that those countries are part of the historic Russia. So now we see this the history is weaponized against these smaller countries.
And of course, that concept would also include Belarus and Ukraine, as well as the republics in the south.
Of course, even Ivan Ilyin, he makes like kind of this kind of characterization. Velika Great Russians, which mean the Russians, and Malorosa, little junior Russians, Belarus and Ukrainians. He also says independent Ukraine is unacceptable. If he wrote this case in 1947, that if Ukraine becomes independent, Germany would take over Ukraine, and then Brits would take over Caucasus, and it will be a blow to Russia and Russian interests. So these ideas about historic Russia and its borders are not the product of one day or 1 year or 10 years or just Putin's rule. It has a history, at least 100 years of history, written on different papers and articles, etc.
And that means that even if Russia loses the war against Ukraine and the internationally recognized borders are put back in place, even if Russia has a degraded military capacity, which, you know, the Russian army is going to be far weaker at the end of this war, it's not going to have the capability industrially to build a modern army again for a very long time because of the money, the resources, but also the high technology it will take. Nonetheless, even a Russia that is weak militarily, I think what you're saying is the ambitions, the philosophy that underpins this imperial behavior, they won't go away. So Russia will remain either a direct threat or a potential threat into the long term.
Again, I would love to quote Ivan Ilyin. He predicted many things, by the way, and he says maybe Russia will collapse, but Russia has that spirit, that force. It will be reborn, and it will strive to restore the historic Russia. And based on the analysis of Russian media and Russian ruling elites, so that ambition will go nowhere. It will stay there. But there are a few opposition voices in Russia, but we don't know what kind backing or popular backing or support they have. What we see that Russia doesn't look to back off from its ambitions. I would like to give you another example from a well-known Russian professor. He sounds like he's against the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, the war. But he says, in any case, I wouldn't like to see my country loses the war. Whether it was right war, wrong war, it was just war or wrong war. I think this view, this phrase, is a good manifestation of how Russian people feels about this war and how, in which direction they would go following the hypothetical loss of this war.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because if you listen to opposition figures within Navalny's team, if you listen to Erka Moskvy, Dozhd, which are back online, you'll see that these liberal opposition commentators actively want Russia to lose the war. They see it as an unjust war. They see it as a terrible crime and a stain on Russia's reputation in the world. But it's easy to think somehow they represent a majority of people. That's probably not true, isn't it? I mean, the opposition media that want Russia to lose are probably a small minority and probably don't reflect the majority of people's opinion across the country.
In Russia, the public opinion are shaped by the official state media, and this Navalny and others are, I think, in a sense, marginalized. They don't represent the majority of the Russian people. I don't mean that indeed Russian people want the war, but the Russian media had shaped a kind of discourse of reality. In that war, in that reality, for the Russian people, the war is inevitable, and the Kremlin or the president had no choice other than going into the war in Ukraine. And Russian media have been involved in this propaganda or in information warfare very heavily, because it is one thing you can fight with Azerbaijan, Armenia, or Central Asians. It is another thing to get into war against Ukraine, to bomb Kiev, which is the birthplace of the Russian state. And in fact, the development of Russian culture and Russian identity is in many ways due to the Kiev. Kiev has been the center of this kind of Russian culture or Russian civilizations, and Russian media has been involved, worked a lot, and Russian ruling elite have worked a lot for that purpose. At least over the last 8 years, every day, every Russian channel has broadcast several political shows, programs dedicated specifically to the Ukrainian topic. That's why, although it is like a cognitive dissonance. On one side, they see that it is their brothers; they cannot get into war, and moreover, war is very harmful for their own life. But on the other side, they think that there is no other way than going into the war. Again, I came to the point we made at the start of our of this episode, that the role of media in Russia is post factum. So if there was a discussion, a deliberation, a debating whether we need to go Ukraine, whether we need to annex Donbass, Crimea, or we need to support the Russian-speaking populations in there, it would have another result, another effect. But the reality is that the information warfare and propaganda has been worked for over at least eight years heavily. And as I gave you example from the Russian professor, from Russian scholar, even if they think that this going into the war was wrong, they don't want their country to lose the war.
Absolutely. I mean, my last question really relates to that. And what we see in propaganda is that it can be incredibly contradictory as well. You can have several narratives in a single day that contradict each other, and somehow people either don't see the lack of logic there, or the conflict between these ideas, they'd sort of just take them all on board, take what they want out of those. And this relates back to the situation in Georgia, because I think you said that, there are more Russian people fleeing conscription that have gone to Georgia than anywhere else, although they're also going to Mongolia and Kazakhstan and Armenia. But there are more in Georgia than anywhere else. And this is being portrayed in some ways as refugees and a protest against the war. But it's not, is it? They're fleeing their obligation to their state to join the army and the special operation. But at the same time, many of these people can have the idea in their head that they're patriots, that they would still want Russia to win the war, and yet, they're not prepared to take on that individual responsibility for it. But it doesn't stop them, as you say, still wanting their country to win and having that kind of emotional, fairly irrational view of the situation.
Yes, in response to your question, a few days ago, a Georgian expert on social media asked his audience as follows: have you ever seen any Russian fleeing Russia have made a protest against war in Georgia? You have not, even a single case have not been registered. The people flee the country not because they're against war, but thus simply as a human level. They don't want to die in this war. They want their country to win, but they don't want to die, or they don't want their close ones, loved ones, to be killed in that country. So we cannot say that several 100,000 people have fled Russia. They are all against war. Even if they were against the war, it doesn't matter a lot, because Russia has around 150 million population, and it is like a drop in a sea. So it is not the fleeing the country is not a measure whether the Russian population against the war or not.
And I have spoken to Russians who are politically active. I have spoken to Russians who have left the country on ideological, moral grounds, but they didn't leave this year. They didn't leave a month ago when conscription was announced. They left in 2012 after Bolotnaya. They left in 2014 after Crimea. They left in 2017, 18, 19, when the foreign agent laws started to become more intense. So those politically and morally active Russians left long before, this current wave of those fleeing conscription. I mean, do you feel that as well from what you've seen?
Sorry, you say?
I mean, do you think that's a correct assumption there, that those who are politically active, those who have an ideological or moral view that the war or Russia's behavior is wrong, they left in previous years, not in the last few months?
Yes, there are many political immigrants, Russian political immigrants, and they have left the country. Some of them many years, some of them many months ago, but some of them on the last day. For example, one former professor of Moscow University, a few days ago left the country, but I think he was rather on political reasons. I would like to quote one Turkish intellectual of Samet Agaoğlu. He traveled in 1967 to Soviet Union for 2 months to see what is happening in Russia. By the way, he was a minister, he was a politician, he was in the government of Adnan Menderes, who was executed in Turkey's first military coup as a result of that coup. He says, even if the governments are successful, they are performing well, they are winning the wars, but at the end of the day, people get tired of the discipline, too much strict rules. So the political immigrants, I think the reason for them to leave the country is that discipline and perhaps this strict rules. And I think that also after the end of the war, we will see how the Russian population reacts to the reacts to the war, especially if the war is, if Russia doesn't achieve its goals in the war. But now we cannot be sure that what they basically think of it, because according to some, again, Russian experts, opposition-minded experts, that when Crimean annexation took place, the Putin's rate increased in Russia, and then it faded away. And then if it takes this Ukrainian regions, it will again go up. Why? Again, because according to some analysis of this views of Russian experts and of Russian media, I can tell in Russia, territorial expansion has been historical, like a national idea. Okay, if you ask me what's Britishness, based on my experience as a student in London, I can say that democracy and every Brit should do their own, should live its own life. You cannot meddle in others' life. That's what basically British is about, a British idea about. But in Russia, what's Russian idea? What's the Russian ideology? At least in the post-Soviet Union, they refer to Ivan Ilyin. He says Russia's national idea must be fostering or upbringing a spiritual character in Russian mass. What is spiritual character? He explains it is about three forces: instinct of self-protection, sense of life, and imagination. Imagination. And these three forces can be put into motion only through love and belief. Love and belief, according to Ivan Ilyin, are very specific, very unique traits of Russian people. And what are the objects of their love and belief? He answers: God, homeland, which is Russia, and national leader, national ruler. You have unconditional love and unconditional belief in God, national, the home Russia, and the national leader. Why you need spiritual character as a national idea? His response is because we have to build Russia on the basis of the spiritual character of the Russian masses. So I think this idea, this view, has at least to some extent worked in Russia, and we can observe it as in the reactions to the war, and we can, I think, this at least a little bit helps us to understand the attitudes to popular attitudes to the war, and why so hardly the Russian government, the Russian ruling group, worked on, to quote Ivan Ilyin, foster this spiritual character in Russian masses.
And of course, if you're part of the liberal intelligentsia, if you're part of the opposition, and you seek values that are different to those, if you seek values that come from both Russia and the West, according to that philosophy, you would cease to be Russian. You cease to be part of that mass and brotherhood. You almost become like an infection in the body that needs to be fought and cut out. And that aligns with some of Putin's language, doesn't it?
Yes. In fact, in Russia, the phrase liberal is oftentimes used as an insult. When political proponents want to insult, to demonize the opponent, they call it liberal. Even the very bizarre thing is that the late Zhirinovsky, he was the head of the Russian Liberal Democrats. He was frequently using this term liberal as to insult his opponents. So that's the controversy. And of course, what I oftentimes quote this Ivan Ilyin, because the President Putin, Sergei Lavrov, Medvedev, and other Russian leaders are frequently referring to Ivan Ilyin. Ivan Ilyin says we need for autocracy. Liberalism and democracy is not for Russia, and communism is not for Russia. We need this national idea, which I explained it to you. Yes, in Russian media space, but we have to know that media, that public opinion are actively shaped by the government media, by official media, are against any notion of liberalism or democracy, and even they portray the Dmitry Kiselev, the head of one of the main media figures in Russian media sphere, portrayed the October Revolution as the first color revolution, and regarded the Orange Revolution in Kiev and Rose Revolution in Tbilisi as continuation of the October Revolution, as a color revolution.
And as part of some kind of process, which is quite a paranoid way of thinking, isn't it? But we know that paranoia also drives some of the policies we're seeing.
You know, probably you have heard this phrase, siloviki, in Russia. The siloviki means that the
security forces, basically, yeah. But yeah, there's no exact equivalent.
Yeah, paranoia is peculiar to security services, special services in any part of the world. That doesn't matter. Russia, Turkey, democracy or not democracy, Britain, US, Germany. But in case of Russia, one gets an impression that not the special services, but the state is governed by paranoia. So paranoia is not a peculiarity of special services in Russia, but also it is peculiar to the running the government.
And Russia is the only country in the world effectively run by the security services. Putin, clearly an FSB agent or a KGB agent. And he comes from that class, he comes from that mindset. So it's not surprising that those paranoid, suspicious values, suspicion of Western ideas, and he's taken that and he's conflated it with the entire state.
I think yes, indeed, he comes from KGB, but if you look in his autobiography, he didn't hold higher positions in KGB because the Soviet Union collapsed, and he changed to the public administration in St. Petersburg. But it comes from the political system of the country. Russia is a big country. It has a long history. It has vast resources, but it has one main fault. It has not been able to decide what kind of country Russia wants. Even Russia has failed to form the view of his history. The history years ago, the Bolsheviks were good. Then they kept a neutral on that, and now the Bolsheviks are the enemy. So political system necessitates this kind of suspicions and paranoia, and also this path dependence. The Soviet Russia originated. Russia is the success of the Soviet Union, and Soviet Union. The KGB was very powerful, and also in Soviet system, they were always suspicious about the foreign agents, foreigners, and foreign ideas. And yet, it has been embedded in the Russian public opinion that foreign forces are against Russia. They want to destroy Russia, and even inside, if a Russian a politician or Russian public view can speak something differently, they just view that through that prism of suspicion and paranoia and the likes.
Well, I think this is probably a good place to end. It's quite a terrifying place to end our interview, but thank you so much for your insights, both into what's happening in the ex-Soviet sphere, but also this exploration of the Russian idea, the Siloviki, and the philosophy that seems to underpin Putin's actions. It's been incredibly insightful. And Rahim, I want to thank you so much for spending so much time talking to us to explain these ideas.
My pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you for having me on your program.